When medical research is testing drugs or interventions or treatments on humans, we call this clinical trials or clinical studies. And this field is called clinical research. There's a lot of technical English language terms which get used in this field, yet medical research happens everywhere in the world. And when there's multinational pharma companies doing research in different places, oftentimes they'll prefer to use the English terms, or when there are local language terms available, it's hard to find out what those are. The pharma companies aren't very open. They're not sharing a lot of these terms. There's a website in the United States. It's called clinicaltrials.gov. And if there's going to be a drug going to market, then it needs the research behind this drug, the trials, the pharma company or whoever's doing the research, they need to register in this website. But in this website, you can also see that research that happens in the United States, sometimes it happens in multiple research sites, including sites in other countries. We know very well that medical research happens in many places. A drug that's going to come to market in the United States, it gets researched in other countries as well. In these other countries, people speak other languages. They have other cultural expectations. There needs to be some kind of cross-cultural dialogue in this. Inside Wikipedia, we share all kinds of information. It's a free and open project. Wikipedia exists in many languages. We translate information across languages, and by, we're very proud in the Wiki community of our medical content, the information we have on diseases, drugs, medical conditions, therapies, even people in medicine, social topics in medicine. We have less coverage in Wikipedia of clinical trials, and I get why that is. Clinical trials, this is primary information. It's not really for the general public. Typically, people care more about what does this disease or medical condition mean to me and my family? What do I need to know about the effects of the drugs or treatments that I might take? This is what people typically want in Wikipedia. But we've seen, for example, in the COVID pandemic, COVID wasn't the issue of just one country or one group of people. This affected everybody in the world. And people were asking, what does it mean to develop a COVID vaccine? To what extent is there research about the COVID vaccine in my community, in my culture? Everybody in the world had to have some kind of response to COVID, and we weren't ready for this in Wikipedia. We weren't ready for this anywhere in the medical sector. The kinds of things that I would want are, how do you communicate the technical concepts of clinical trials across cultures and across languages? Well, in Wikipedia, we look to see what are the terms we need to translate and who's already translated this, what kind of expert sources are in place. I'll give you some basic examples. How do you translate the concept of clinical trial outside of English language? You translate this into every language of the world. How do you translate the peculiar terms associated with clinical trials, like research participant, which is what we call the person who volunteers to participate in the trial, or research site? When there's cohorts of participants, well, we say the word cohort, you can also call it an arm of the study, an arm. Why not just say group? Well, there's a custom in English language, so we don't typically call these a group. We give them a technical term. These kind of things happen often. If you have a problem, you have an adverse event. Adverse is an English language term, but is it okay to just use the word bad if you're going into another language? What's wrong with using bad? How can you use simple English to help translators and local language communities understand what kind of meaning you have when you're using these terms and you're translating this across languages? And why would anyone even care about this? There's some questions that came up. Like, for example, in a given country, was there any COVID vaccine or any COVID medical research at all happening in that country? This is a matter of public interest. People want to know about this. And if we pull in the data from clinicaltrials.gov, which we did in Wikidata, we're able to query these kind of things. We can do things like put the particular research studies by their research sites on the map. People can do these kind of queries. And I'm not saying that this would turn into Wikipedia articles. It's just too specific. It's too technical for Wikipedia. But there's some basic information that people need to know about medical research and whether it's happening in their countries. And supposing you're in a lower or middle income country, and there is going to be some medical research in your community, and someone comes up to you and says, would you like to participate in a research project to test an experimental COVID vaccine? For us to develop the COVID vaccines we have, That means that there were a lot of COVID vaccines tested. Most of these didn't work out. This research happened all across the world. And there needed to be some kind of explanation. What is the clinical trial? What does it mean to consent to this? What are my risks? What is an adverse event? What would make the trial proceed? Under what conditions do you terminate? Who's doing the monitoring of the safety of these trials, either directly with the research participants or checking the data to see how this is happening? To what extent do we have a duty to inform the people who are participating in these trials of the risks? And also, what about the community risk? If you have a clinical trial hosted in a community, do the people who are not involved in the clinical trials need some disclosure about this research happening in their community? And I would say yes, because of course, if people volunteer for the clinical trial and they get injured, that's their problem, but also that's a community burden to bear. Everybody in the community is affected if anybody comes to any harm in the course of clinical trials. And there could be a global conversation about this, but there's a lot of reasons why there isn't. One of the reasons is the pharmaceutical companies themselves, the pharma companies, they don't share a lot of information about clinical trials. This is their proprietary commercial product. It's something they're developing. And it's not that I want to invade in private health information, but if I were to go to a pharma company and I would say, could you give me the publicly accessible information about clinical trials in these communities in which you're working? They may not be forthcoming with this information. So if we know that a pharmaceutical company is operating clinical trials in a non-English community and a non-Western culture, if I were to say, can you give me the vocabulary that you're using to explain these kind of concepts? It's just not available. This isn't open data. It's not copyright-free content, public domain that we can reuse in Wikipedia and recycle. And so in the course of things, I and some people in the wiki community, it's hard to do this. This is an impossible task. But we tried to coordinate some translation. Here in the United States, on the website clinicaltrials.gov, which is public domain, as all works of the U.S. federal government are public domain, there's something called the Glossary of Common Site Terms. Somebody in clinicaltrials.gov, the United States government, they listed technical terms that they thought people in the United States needed to know and have definitions for, laymen, if they're going to participate in clinical trials or if they're going to discuss clinical trials. Now, when this glossary got compiled, it's about 100 terms. It's not as if anyone had the objective of translating these. These are actually difficult to translate terms. But such as it is, Wikipedia is a multicultural project. We had a go with this. I collaborated with different translators. I tried to connect these terms to structured data, Wikipedia articles that explain the topics fully when that's available, and when there are no full explanations, no encyclopedia articles about this, we have this collection, Wikidata, which is simple definitions, structured data, brief explanations of things. I connected the glossary of common site terms into concepts in Wikidata, and from there, I sent these terms to local language communities, to people who would translate these, in anticipation of future clinical trials happening in these regions, and also recognizing that clinical trials are happening everywhere in the world. These affect everybody, and everybody's a stakeholder. It's not that people in the field of medicine need to control this. It's everybody's business. Health is a global issue. How it worked out is I've got these translations in Wikidata. We had an experience. I published some content. If somebody wants to query these terms, they can pull them out of Wikidata. I'm not claiming any copyright on them. They're in Wikidata. I wanted to share them. But I need more of these terms. I actually need these terms translated into every language of the world, at least every language of the world where people are using medical products, where people have some kind of stake in the research that affects their lives. And I need to come up with a more standardized process for doing this, collaborating with local communities. I can have this conversation because I'm in the wiki community, and we're able to talk publicly about the problems we face, the challenges that we experience in communicating across cultures. The pharmaceutical companies, forget it. It's hard to get any information about them. If I wanted multilingual information from pharmaceutical companies, it's just unprecedented. However, if you're at a pharmaceutical company and you have some information to share, what do you know? Wikipedia is a repository. You can put your stuff there, and I'd love to have it. So, such as it is, we're trying to make the world a better place, inform people about medical research, coordinate better protections for research participants, and better informed communities about all these things. If you want to check it out, come to WikiProject Clinical Trials in Wikidata, or talk with WikiProject Medicine in Wikipedia or Wikidata. Thanks for hearing me out.